Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, my dear brothers and sisters. Welcome back to our noble series, Small Deeds, Big Rewards. Today we have a deed up for discussion that has an enormous reward, and allow me to set the stage for it. Hadith comes in Sahih al-Bukhari from Abu Sa'id al-Khudri radiyallahu anhu that once our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is addressing his companions, and he tells them, "Aya'jizu ahadukum an taqra'a thuluth al-Qur'an fi layli." Are y'all really not capable of doing 1/3 of the Qur'an during your nights? Like, what's stopping you from doing 10 juz every night? So Abu Sa'id radiallahu anh says, فَشَقَّ ذَلِكَ عَلَيْهِمْ. This comment of the Prophet was really hard on them, because it felt like the Prophet is on their case. The Prophet is telling them, you need to work harder. How come y'all are not stepping up? So they tell the Prophet, Ya Rasulullah, وَأَيُّنَا يُطِيقُ ذَلِكَ. Ya Rasulullah, which one of us can handle this every night? Like, we work all day for hours. Some of us are working the fields, and for us to then stand in prayer for multiple hours, to recite 10 juz, you're looking at like 4 to 6 hours worth of reading. And then how many of us have actually memorized that much of the Qur'an? So they said, Ya Rasulullah, who amongst us can sustain this? So now the setup is perfect, my dear brothers and sisters. Their anxiety is a little high. The Sahabas are a little bit worked up by this request, and this is where the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, rahmatul lil alameen, he delivers a relief. فَقَالَ اللَّهُ الْوَاحِدُ الصَّمَدُ ثُلُثُ الْقُرْآنِ. Indeed, the surah of Allah al-Wahid al-Samad, meaning Surah Al-Ikhlas, is 1/3 of the Qur'an. My dear brothers and sisters, just wrap your head around this. Reward of 10 juz in just a few lines. And our Prophet would often teach with this contrasting style, where he got you thinking in one direction, and then he would deliver a spiritual gem from another direction, because we appreciate things in contrast. So in another hadith in Sahih Muslim, Abu Hurairah radiyallahu anhu tells us that once the Prophet also made an announcement in the masjid, "Uhshudu, gather up my companions, because I want to recite upon you 1/3 of the Qur'an." So the narration goes on to say that the companions started to gather, particularly those who had the time, the bandwidth, the stamina, because they understood it's going to be a long night. So imagine the Imam announces that it's going to be a long night of Taraweeh. You're going to get your water ready, your electrolytes. So anyway, the Sahaba who had the capacity, they started to gather. And then the Prophet ﷺ comes out and he begins the recitation with قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ, and he recites the surah, and then he just goes back into his home. And the Sahaba, they're kind of scratching their heads. And mind you, the home of the Prophet is connected to the masjid. So the Prophet just steps inside, and the Sahaba are thinking to themselves, why take a break so quickly? And they started to discuss amongst themselves that perhaps revelation is coming down and the Prophet had to step inside for some privacy. Maybe some news from the heavens is being communicated to him, and he's going to come out very soon and resume the recitation. And the Prophet could overhear their rumblings. So the Prophet steps out once more and he says, I told you all that I would recite upon you 1/3 of the Qur'an, and indeed the surah I just recited equals 1/3 of the Qur'an. Subhanallah. It is astounding the reward you and I get just for 4 ayat, my dear brothers and sisters. Now here, I'm sure a question crosses your mind, because this is a question that scholars past and present have raised, and that is, what does it mean for this surah to equal 1/3 of the Qur'an? One group of scholars say that it equals 1/3 of the Qur'an in terms of meaning. Specifically, they say when you look at the Qur'an holistically, you cannot help but notice the Qur'an has 3 overarching aims. Number 1, ahkam. These are your do's and your don'ts. These are the halal and the haram in terms of how we're supposed to behave in this world. Number 2, akhbar. These are your news and your information. News about the past, what happened to the past prophets, what happened to those who accepted the message versus those who rejected the message. And of course, the seerah of the Prophet is covered there. And of course, news about the future. We're talking about the signs of the Day of Judgment, and the Day of Judgment itself, and the stations of the Day of Judgment, and the description of heaven and hell. All of that is covered under akhbar. And that leads us to the 3rd, and that is Tawheed. This deals with who your Creator is, and His uniqueness, and His oneness, and His names and attributes. And they say Ikhlas, with profound conciseness, covers the last aim, and that is Tawheed, and therefore is 1/3 of the Qur'an. And this is actually supported by a hadith in the Musnad of Imam Ahmad, where the Prophet ﷺ says, "Inna Allah jazza al-Qur'ana thalathata ajza'in." Allah has apportioned the Qur'an in 3 portions. فَجَعَلَ قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدْ جُزْءًا مِّنْ أَجْزَاءِ الْقُرْآنِ. And He made قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدْ one of those portions of the Qur'an. The great Mufassir Ibn Juzay al-Kalbi al-Gharnati from Muslim Spain, he puts it like this. He says, the aims of the Qur'an are once again 3 themes. Number 1, introduction to the Creator. Number 2, to tell you how to worship that Creator. And number 3, all the motivations, positive enforcement, negative enforcement, all the motivations you need to worship that Creator. And of course, that involves knowledge of the Day of Judgment. That involves knowledge of the reward and the punishment. And that involves stories of the Prophet. So that's once again a slightly different way of looking at 3 macro aspects of the Qur'an. And once again, Suratul Ikhlas, also known as Suratul Tawheed, deals with 1/3 of that division and therefore is 1/3 of the Qur'an. The second group of scholars, my dear brothers and sisters, they say when the Prophet says ta'dilu thuluth al-Qur'an, the Prophet is referring to the reward. That the reward of this surah is like reading 10 juz. Why? Because they say Allah has a special love for this surah. So when someone recites it with the right intention and the expectation of the reward, Allah gives you that reward. To help you appreciate Allah's love for this surah, hadith comes in Bukhari. Aisha radiyallahu anha says that once the Prophet ﷺ sent out a group on a military expedition, and the person in charge of this expedition, the leader of the army, of course he is also leading them in prayer. And the narration goes on to say that whenever he would lead them in the prayer, he would end it with قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدْ. Now, narration seems to suggest that every rak'ah has قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدْ, or at the very least, the last thing he recites in that prayer is قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدْ. And the people praying behind him, they find this a little bit strange because they have never heard the Prophet ﷺ do this. So as soon as the mission is over, they go back to the Prophet ﷺ and they say, Ya Rasulullah, this person features Suratul Ikhlas in every rak'ah or every prayer. So the Prophet ﷺ says, why don't you go ask him? Let's not make assumptions. Let's ask him directly. So they went and asked this companion why he does what he does, and he told them something beautiful. He said, لِأَنَّهَا صِفَةُ الرَّحْمَنِ وَأَنَا أُحِبُّ أَنْ أَقْرَأَ بِهَا. He says, the reason I recite Suratul Ikhlas in every rak'ah and prayer is because this surah has the description of the most merciful, and I absolutely love reciting it over and over again. When they told the Prophet about this response of his, the Prophet said, أخبروا, inform him that Allah loves him back. Allah loves him for the love he has for this surah. Now, my dear brothers and sisters, one last question we need to address. The fairness question. How do we rationalize the fact that someone takes hours upon hours to recite 10 juz and another person in a matter of few seconds can earn the same reward? How does that work? And here our scholars say that you have to keep in mind the multiplier effect when you read the Qur'an. So when you and I, my dear brothers and sisters, when you recite the Qur'an, as you know, the Prophet ﷺ famously told us that for every letter you recite, there's a multiplier of 10. So when you say Alif Lam Mim, the 3 become 30. So when someone recites 1/3 of the Qur'an, they are reciting almost 100,000 letters. So they get the reward of those 100,000 plus letters plus the multiplier of 10. Now the beauty of Suratul Ikhlas is that when you recite Suratul Ikhlas, you get the reward of reciting 100,000 plus letters. Still a massive reward, 100,000 letters in a matter of few seconds. But of course, out of Allah's fairness, when someone actually recites 10 juz, they will get the multiplier effect as well. This way you see Allah's grace and you see Allah's justice both at play simultaneously. I pray that we are able to recite the surah every night. As the Prophet ﷺ said, are you really not capable of reciting this every night? Yes, we are, Ya Rasulullah. Let us make it a habit. Jazakumullahu khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.